All votes. Got it. And all votes will be taken by roll call. Brian, should I go back and reread that, or is that okay?
Yeah, I think it's probably a good idea to.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. Sorry for the technical difficulties this morning. I'd like to call the committee meeting to order. As permitted by the Governor's Disaster Declaration of April 1st, 2022, determination has been made that an in-person meeting isn't practical or prudent, so the committee can meet virtually. So to ensure a transparent and open meeting as possible, CMAP will post meeting materials approximately 1 week advance and provide a recording of the meeting linked on the CMAP website, and we will take all of our votes via roll call. I'm going to turn it over to staff so they can make some additional virtual meeting logistical announcements before we take the meeting roll. Thanks. Oh, Jamie, was there any additional?
Like we've lost Brian. This is just a comedy of errors this morning. Oh, goodness. Okay, that's all right. We're just going to roll with it. So as Chair Dernbaugh said, this meeting is being recorded. It is on Zoom. So just quickly, if you're not familiar with Zoom, we have a chat box. If you want to ask a question, report an issue. Again, please mute yourself if you are not actively speaking. And we request that only committee members speak during this time. We will have a moment for public comment near the end. And please, you can change your name. There's 3 dots if you highlight your video box, and you can change your name and also include the organization to make it a little bit easier to know where you're coming from. All right, and that are the staff announcements.
Thank you, Jamie, and welcome back, Brian. I suppose at this point, staff, could you read the call or call the roll, please?
Sure. Thanks. Sorry for my brief sojourn there. Chair Aaron Dernbaugh.
Present.
Deborah Stone.
Present.
Jack Chan.
Present.
Naomi Davis. Martha Dooley. Elena Grossman.
Present.
Cynthia Canner.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, hi, Cynthia.
Oh, I can't hear you guys. I did for a second, now I can't. Okay, Cynthia Canner. I'll check my...
Great, sorry about that. Marcella Bondi-Keenan.
Present.
Elizabeth Coach. Thomas Maylard.
Present.
Edith Mekra. Red Mansour.
Present.
Paul May. Stacy Myers.
Present.
Mary Nickel. Ted Penesis.
Here.
Vanessa Ruiz. And Jen Walling. Okay, well, we do have a quorum, so we are set to continue. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. And I see Mary there. Did you get Mary Nicole?
Yes, we got Mary. Thanks.
Okay, I didn't hear that on my side. Thank you. Are there any, so it sounds like we have a quorum and we can move forward with today's activities. Are there any changes to the agenda that was distributed as part of the meeting announcements?
No, there are no changes to the agenda. I think the one announcement we wanted to make, and this may not apply for this meeting, but just for the future, I know at times members will need to send sort of a proxy or another person from their organization to attend the meeting in their place. That's totally fine, but we just wanted to clarify that if you do send someone as a substitute, they will not be able to vote on matters before the committee. So we just wanted to let everyone know about that. Thanks.
Thank you, Brian. We will move on to announcements. I guess that was an announcement. I believe there is one other one that CMAP wanted me to share, which is if you haven't done your open meetings act training, please do that soon. I think we're right at the timeline that needs to be completed, and the certificate of completion needs to be sent to Brian or Jamie. So I'd encourage everybody to do it. I was also a little tardy in doing mine, and I sent it over last week. So please do that. Otherwise, they'll probably be following up with you. I think at this point, no other announcements, Brian or Jamie?
Yeah, thanks for that one, Aaron. And just to follow up on that, we know that the Attorney General's website is a bit difficult to navigate. So if you have any trouble getting yourself set up with an account or taking the Open Meetings Act training, just let us know and we can help you through that process. We know it is not an easy one.
Thanks. And with that, I'm going to turn it over for Director Alleman to make her announcements to the committee. Welcome, Erin.
Hi, good morning, Aaron. And also, I just wanted to double check that Cynthia Canner can hear us. I see a smile.
I'm very excited to say that I can.
Okay.
Thank you. It helps to turn the headphones on.
You know, I mean, all these things that you have to do in advance to get ready for online meetings. Well, thanks. My goal is to make it to all of our committee meetings as often as I can to provide you with some insights from the other committees, from our board meetings, and just offer you the opportunity to have discussion with me or ask me questions about sort of what we are doing here as an agency. I know you have some good stuff on your agenda here this morning, so I won't take long, but I did want to provide you all with an update on where we are in terms of the 2050 plan update. We are coming up on a few key milestones in regards to the 2050 plan update. It's slated for approval in October is our goal. A presentation went to our board last month. You know, I want to share that this is sort of a stepping stone for us. It's sort of taking inventory of where we are and in our advancement of our 2050 goals, and you know, really sort of measuring what we've succeeded and understanding what's changed since 2050 was approved in 2018. So we aren't changing the core values of the plan. Really, it was built on the principles of inclusive growth, on resilience, and prioritizing our investments here across the region. And I think many of you would agree that all of these things are more relevant today, given the fact that the pandemic has really hurt communities in many ways that were unexpected, but also in some ways very expected. If you know, you looked at sort of the data and information that those communities had prior to going into the pandemic, they weren't well prepared. So this update will meet our federal requirements, and the purpose is to update our data to meet the current situations, to respond to adjustments in the regionally significant project status. Getting a little bit of feedback, so if you're not on mute, I'll just ask that you put yourself on mute. And then also we want to analyze and refine the plan's financial plan for our region's transportation system. One thing that happened that we had hoped would happen, but we weren't sure when we passed 2050 was that the state increased motor fuel taxes, indexed it to inflation, passed a capital program. So again, we want to look at that and also sort of what's out there with our big infrastructure bill that happened on the federal level and how that impacts budgets again here locally. This spring, we developed preliminary regional socioeconomic forecast data, including demographic and employment projections for the region. You know, this data really showed that there's less job growth that's projected for our region than we anticipated for our plan 4 years ago. There are also some significant shifts to population projections for the next 30 years. Apologies for the sirens in the background here, but you know, and it's not unlike sort of the changes that we saw during the Great Recession of 09, 08 here, that you know, things have slowed down, and if we aren't intentional about the ways that we address these impacts to our economies, we can continue to see prolonged slow growth that we've seen here across our region for some time here. But taking a look at some of the longer-term transportation system funding analytics and data, we expect about $485 billion in core revenues to be available for transportation infrastructure over the 28-year planning horizon. Again, of this amount, 96.5% of those dollars go towards our existing system, maintenance, modernization, you know, technology enhancements that need to happen as cars become more tech savvy and data, thinking about electric vehicle infrastructure, So maintenance, modernization of the existing system accounts for 96.5% of those resources. Funds for new transit, roads, and bridges represent only about 3.5% of the total budget that we anticipate over the next 30 years or so. Because we're undertaking a minor update of 2050, we continue to use the definitions of the regionally significant projects from the 2050 plan when it was developed in 2018. Many of the projects that are on the regionally significant projects list were included in 2050. There are about 70 regionally significant projects, things like, looking at Metro Rail, the Red Line extension south from 95th Street to 130th Street, the reconstruction of 290 with the blue line out to the Forest Park branch, Eldon O'Hare Western Access, but, a lot of multimodal projects. In the near term, in the first half of those years, we're seeing a lot of transit projects advance faster than some of the highway projects, but all of that information is available, and there's a benefits report that will be presented with this information to the Transportation Committee, available on Friday, but their meeting's next week. We've been hosting stakeholder workshops as well to start getting input from our implementers, from government partners, from community-based organizations and advocates across the region. We'll continue to refine our projections, and then at our June board meeting and MPO meeting, we anticipate that they will release the plan for public comment that will be out for the summer. And then I think that's it for the long range plan. I wanted to touch on just a couple other big projects that we've got ongoing here. We've been working with the Brookings Institute and the Chicago Community Trust on a project that focuses on strengthening our regional coordination and regional economic status here as a region, working with all of the county board chairs, the city of Chicago, and their economic development entities here, and engaging civic, government, and private sector leaders across the region. We had a convening in March really to identify some discrete activities for business and implementation plans here. Our second convening of the county board chairs and these partners will be in July to review and endorse these activation plans that we're developing. So many other regions across the country have a regional layer of economic development that happens, and it complements the local and the county economic development and the state economic development activities by providing things like, a single point of entry for a business, making sure that our businesses aren't competing against each other within the region, and that we're putting in place some protocols and some policies that help support greater collaboration here for the business community. We're also developing a proprietary tool that will look at occupations and job quality and accessibility across our region. And it will look at data from regional, county, and zip code geographics here. And we hope to use this information with our county EDOs, and perhaps our local EDOs will find this valuable as well, really to look at sort of the equitable access related to regional clusters of our strengths, our competitive strengths, and regional jobs here across the region. And this really builds on a lot of our work that calls for thinking about how local incentives, could be enhanced and provide greater value to the state, local, and regional levels as well. And this will clearly articulate some of the data that will be necessary to, I think, be more thoughtful about economic development in our region. I also wanted to touch on quickly here to our ADA program, and then I'll turn it back over to Erin here. But we have hired a new ADA planning director who will lead the agency's program development and implementation around ADA and Title II compliance. We are committed to investing about $10 million over the next 10 years to help support our communities reach and achieve their Title II compliance across the region. This isn't a new requirement, but it is something that our region is woefully underperforming in. Her name is Linda Mastandria. So if you or your organization or the government that you work for has an ADA coordinator that we should be reaching out to, please do feel free to let Brian or Jamie or myself know, and we'll put you in touch with Linda. Again, Linda comes to us from FEMA, where she's worked in their Office of Disability Integration and Coordination. So she has a great background in these subject areas, these issues, understanding how municipalities work after a disaster. I think we're super excited to get this program up and running, and have been hiring staff and hope to provide training, data, and
a huge moment for DOT
development of these plans across our region.
So I wanted
Sounds like
to
there's a
invite
little
the
bit
panelists
of
themselves.
background again here, but I'm going to turn it over to Aaron and happy to answer any questions from the committee.
Thanks so much, Director Alleman. Are there any questions from the committee for Aaron? All right. Well, hearing none.
I have my little hand up.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see it.
I should put my big hand up. Thank you for that overview. Just quick question on the regional coordination. Is the McHenry County's Economic Development Corporation connected with that?
They are connected and have been meeting with us monthly. So
Okay, awesome. Thanks.
Any other questions for Aaron? Oh, let me double check. There's no hands up. All right. Hearing none. Thanks very much, Aaron. Thanks for joining us this morning. And we're going to go on to the approval of the minutes. So there was a link to the minutes in the meeting invitation. I hope that, and it was also in the meeting packet. These were the minutes from March 29th, 2022, the first meeting of this committee. Were there any changes or corrections to the minutes that anyone wanted to request? All right, hearing none, could I get a motion and a second to approve those minutes?
Motion, Thomas Maylard.
Thomas, thank you. A second?
I will second. Cynthia Canner.
Thank you. So the Thomas Maylard motion and Cynthia Canner second. Were there any questions on the motion? If none, we can, staff, could you call the roll so we could vote on approving the minutes?
Yes, thank you, Chair Dernbaugh. Chair Dernbaugh,
Approve.
Vice Chair Stone,
Aye.
Jack Chan,
Aye.
Naomi Davis, Martha Dooley, Elena Grossman. Yeah. Cynthia Canner,
Aye.
Marcella Bondi-Keenan.
Aye.
Elizabeth Coach. Thomas Maylard.
Aye.
Edith Macra.
Hey,
Red Ma-
it's Naomi. I'm sorry I couldn't get to my mute button in time. I'm here.
Hi, Naomi. Do you have a vote on the motion?
Did you hear me? Aye.
Thank you. Edith Macra. Red Mansour.
Aye.
Paul May. Stacy Myers.
Abstain, was not present.
Mary Nicole.
Aye.
Ted Penesis.
Aye.
Vanessa Ruiz.
Aye.
And Jen Walling. Okay, we have a majority in favor.
Thanks very much, Brian. We'll move on to the body of our agenda. And the first item up under new business is a review of the feedback that came in following the last meeting's presentation on strategic direction, approaches, and measures. And I believe Alex Ensign, Director of Strategic Alignment and Innovation at CMAP, will take us away for this section. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. Good morning, everyone. My name is Alex Ensign. I am about 2 months old in this position as the new Director of Strategic Alignment and Innovation, and I'm really happy to join you today. In the first meeting you had, Brian Elke from my team led a really substantive discussion on our strategic direction in the climate focus area, and I wanted to share some of the feedback we received because we received a lot of great written feedback, and just have a little bit more of a discussion about further refining these approaches. And hopefully it won't be too long, but I'd love to just hear a few more thoughts verbally before we kick off a series of staff workshops over the summer to really finalize these approaches. So this is still a work in progress, but we're hoping to finalize some of the approaches for the strategic direction over the summer and pivot to a little bit of a different direction in September with the strategic alignment and how we engage this community. Please go to the next slide. So just as a refresher, the climate strategic direction focuses on approaches. Those were your if and statements that lead to outcomes. So if and we do this, it leads to this. These outcomes will fulfill these objectives, and these objectives will ultimately lead to the goal of a region that takes action to mitigate and adapt to the effects of climate change and preserve high quality water resources. So I know in the meeting a few months ago, we discussed approaches 1.1 and 1.2. And if you go to the next slide, we can look at some of the written feedback that has been collected for those approaches. So we asked for you to rate the approaches with 1 being the lowest rating and 3 being the highest rating. And there was some variation, but it looks like approaches 1.1 and 3.2 were the ones that were the highest rated, with 2.2 also getting a rather high rating. And there was some really good feedback in terms of notes for each of the approaches that weren't rated well that we will be considering as we go through these staff workshops and really refine and finalize these approaches. Next slide, please. So just to give you a sense of our process and open the room up for discussion, virtual room, I wanted to actually just jump into some of the approaches that were discussed in the last meeting to hear if there's a little bit additional feedback that folks would like to contribute. So I apologize that it's a word heavy slide, but I wanted to share that we have these original approaches on the left and a proposed revised version that committee members helped to craft, as well as some bulleted notes at the top of the slide. So one of the notes that I thought was particularly interesting was clarifying the connection between transportation and the protection of water resources. Also defining resilience, perhaps being more explicit about what we mean by resilience, because it's a very broad term. There's also a question of whether we want to be much more explicit or if we want to be really broad and inclusive with the term resilience in our strategic direction. And I was just wondering if anyone had anything verbal that they'd like to add to some of this written feedback that we got, and perhaps some suggestions for how we could further refine these approaches as we take these notes back to our staff, CMAP, over the summer. So open it up to the room if anyone has any thoughts and would like to share.
So we're commenting specifically only on the outcome transportation network will have increased resilience, correct?
So that somebody driving from one end of Michigan can get to Wisconsin seamlessly. That
Alex, there was a question about it, we're just commenting on this slide that's in front of us, correct?
Yes, there will be a few more slides, but I was tackling one set of approaches and outcome for each slide, yes.
Any other questions or comments on this approach, and specifically this approach 2.1?
Okay, so the two approaches, the two revised approaches are going to get us to our outcomes. Okay, so I definitely think it's an improvement. I don't see all of the community suggestions reflected here necessarily. I don't know if that's because they were sort of out of scope for this particular strategy, or they're maybe integrated somewhere else.
Yeah, these are not finalized revised versions. These are just kind of some partially proposed revised versions. So they don't reflect all the feedback. Some of the bulleted notes, I think, didn't necessarily translate into how to form it into one approach, which was one reason why I thought it would be helpful to open it up to discussion and hear what might be the best to add to it.
That makes sense. I think for me, it would help to maybe to see the document or this approach in context. Like I would probably start with a glossary of definitions, and that would get at some of the conversation we had last time. And then I'd probably have some front matter about the fact that these are all systems and they influence each other, and maybe a graphic to that effect and how the actions interplay with each other. So people don't feel the sense of something's missing, because you understand that really any one or two approaches can't get at the entire system, but they do work together in a network.
I would agree with that, Stacey Myers. I mean, the one thing that I see that's missing in the climate strategic direction here, and I apologize that I wasn't at the first meeting to partake in the discussion, but if you look at the IPCC and UN approach, they recognize the trifecta of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution being entwined as the three self-inflicting planetary crises of our time. And if we're looking at just water and not nature-based solutions as called out, when nature-based solutions is really being heralded across the United States and America the Beautiful in 30 by 30, as well as in IPCC climate circles, I'm wondering how that aligns and squares with the global and national approach to just really look at water and then have best management practices fall under water that could or could not be nature-based solutions. And taking an approach, I agree, at the outset to be able to define how we're addressing those three factors, I think is important, so that it's very clear they're not siloed.
Stacey, I wanted to just hop in here and say, recognizing that I wasn't on mute, so my apologies if I was making noises or talking to myself. I think one of the things that we're trying to do with the strategic plan is really understand how CMAP can use it based on the funding and expertise that we have to drive change to advance the 2050 plan. So I recognize that there are some bigger sort of higher order approaches to how we might want to accomplish this. I think that's one of the constraints that we have, though, is that we're really trying to make sure that as we look at where we have funding, where we have staff expertise, that we may not be able to achieve all of those things on our own, and that we're trying to find sort of our best lane for advancing these goals and objectives.
I respect that. I am wondering, however, with the extent that CMAP has been a powerhouse and a necessity in the realm of nature-based solutions, everything through to the green infrastructure vision and your own mapping, of understanding the alignment of land use and transportation with the funding that's flowing in the jobs aspect through either the Civilian Climate Corps or other avenues, including energy, but not exclusively energy through CEJA. Nature-based solutions really is one of the drivers, as well as one of the impacted areas that's central to ensuring that we have a sustainable region. And I'm just wondering how we can capture that within this climate strategic direction so that we don't lose that instrumental piece that you all have been invaluable in providing in the region since well before your inception into the days of NIPSI.
I would echo that's an excellent point, and I've captured these notes and look forward to discussing this with the staff, because I think that's an excellent point.
Are there any other comments or feedback on this approach 2 and 2.1 and 2.2, which is in front of us? I guess I had a question for you, Alex. You talked about how this feedback would be summarized and shared with the staff work moving forward to refine this. Could you just talk a little bit more about that process? We sort of talked, I think it was Marcella's question about, how the feedback is being collected and summarized, but maybe how you anticipate using it and refining it with staff or else back out to the committee through this process?
Yes, and I am brand new, so this is still also me getting acquainted with CMAP, but the goal that the program management office that I lead has for the summer is to have a series of workshops all across the agency. We're having workshops in each division. We're also going to have workshops devoted to each focus area. And then later on in the summer, workshops where we focus on how the focus areas intertwine, so that we do make sure that we're thinking about climate when we're thinking about transportation, and thinking about how our transportation strategies intersect with the economy. So really making sure we're taking that holistic approach. So that's going to be a series of, I think, 10 or 12 workshops beginning in June through July. And what I will be doing with my team is presenting the committee's feedback and using that feedback to drive conversations with staff, so that we can, as an agency, revise these approaches, come to a consensus about whether these approaches are, in a good final state, and then publish a draft version of the strategic direction so that that can ultimately be shared with the committees and shared publicly, and indicate the focus of the agency for the next few years. So in September, I hope to continue engaging the committees in the strategic direction, but hopefully with a more finalized version of the direction to present.
Thank you. Erin?
Did you have something to add, Erin?
I was just going to say, and hopefully with some a little bit more comprehensive details so that you all can see how this work sort of fits within all of the other work that we have ongoing, because there is yesterday's conversation of the Regional Economy Committee too. It's, our technical assistance work sort of happens across all three areas: transportation, regional economy, and climate. And so do our programs and policies. And so I think that bigger picture will be important to share with committee members.
Thanks. Ray, it looks like you have your hand up there.
I do, thank you. Based on the comments that were just made and the clarification by Erin, would it be wise to at least acknowledge some of the things that are relevant within climate, but then state the focus or the lane that CMAP wants to go in, so that it doesn't appear that this committee or this final report will be myopic, that we didn't see it, we were blinded by it. And so just to avoid any other critical review after the fact. So maybe acknowledging, we can talk about public health and nature-based solutions, all of it's all related. We're all doing this to improve quality of life and health in the end. But I understand that CMAP's mission or the funding is not going to go into that all inclusive direction of what climate action encompasses. So I don't know if that is something to consider, an acknowledgement and then the focus. Thank you.
Thanks, Ray. That's a great comment.
Yes, I appreciate that. And we will have, a section of narrative setting the context for each of these focus areas before we, in the final document, before we move into the actual approaches and outcomes and objectives. So there will be a pretty, substantive narrative that introduces and sets context, and also outlines CMAP's scope for the climate strategic focus.
Excellent. Is there any more on this slide, or are there other slides in this agenda item?
I could go over more slides, but I mostly just wanted to indicate as an example what we'll be taking with us as staff, and just wanted to indicate how much we appreciated your feedback. If there's any other written feedback that you did want to provide on any of these approaches and outcomes and objectives, please feel free to send them. But we will be taking this feedback and considering it carefully over the summer as we continue to refine the strategic direction. So if you'd like, you can skip my next few slides, since I don't want to take up too much of the meeting with that discussion.
Okay, well, I think we're, is there any last questions or comments for Alex before we switch to the next item on our agenda? All right, hearing none, we're going to move on to the next item, which is the climate mitigation work plan overview. And I believe Brian, Jason, Jared, Martin, I don't know who's taking over, but looks like Jason's off mute. So hand it over to Jason.
Thank you, Aaron. Brian, did you have any sort of intro comments you wanted to make before we got started on this?
Sure, just really briefly, as you know from the first meeting, when you approved the work plan for the Climate Committee, we have a different theme for each of the quarterly meetings, and the theme for this month is mitigation. So we wanted to give you an overview of the work that CMAP has been doing on greenhouse gas emissions mitigation. So Jason will provide kind of an overview of the work we've been doing and what's to come in the next fiscal year, and we're going to discuss a few example projects to give you an idea of how we're working on those goals.
Thank you, Brian. And good morning, everyone. I'm Jason Nabota. I'm a director in the Plan Implementation and Legislative Affairs group. And I know many of you over the years working in the environmental space. And we are now really dialing in on some of the climate work, some of the climate goals of the plan, and setting forth some of what you saw Alex present, a strategy for some very explicit implementation of the climate goals, reaching the climate goals. And so our presentation this morning, as Brian sort of mentioned, I'm going to start at a very large scale, and then I think you'll notice it sort of builds in a going down in scale sort of way from overall goals to greenhouse gas inventory for the region, and then to some more project-oriented things. So let's go to the next slide, please. All right, so there's been some talk this morning about On to 2050 and the plan update. I hope you're all familiar with it, but as a reminder and a refresher, there is an environment goal, and that is to have a region prepared for climate change. That's just one of the environment goals. The other two are having an integrated approach to water resources and having development practices that protect natural resources. So this is just one of the three environment goals. And I also, just as an aside, want to remind everyone that, and this sort of builds on the conversation during Alex's presentation. The regional plan is a very big plan. It has hundreds of actions and recommendations, and naturally CMAP cannot take it all on at once. And if you look at the plan and the implementation strategies, you will see that we identify a number of different parties, including ourselves, that should be responsible for implementing some of these activities. So, we fully recognize that there's way more there than we can take on. So we're being fairly deliberate about choosing some very specific things that we can address and directing our limited resources to those activities. So what you're seeing here is some of the work we're doing in that regard as it relates to the climate work, which is one of our three plan implementation strategies. Climate is one of those. The regional economy is another implementation priority, and the region's transportation system is the third priority that we are focusing on as an agency over the next 3 to 5 years and likely beyond, because these are long-term issues. But getting back to my presentation here, so this environment goal has 2 broad strategies. I think everyone's familiar with how climate action is divided more or less into 2 categories. One is climate mitigation, that is reducing emissions, and the other is preparing for more extreme weather and being more resilient to extreme weather impacts and minimizing losses associated with those impacts. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, climate is one of the 3 implementation priorities for the agency. And that decision-making and strategic discussion occurred a few years ago when Aaron first started at CMAP. We went into a strategic planning session and decided on those 3 implementation priorities. And soon after that, I and others on staff got started preparing a sort of longer term climate implementation strategy to try to identify different pathways that the agency should be taking in order to achieve those climate goals and strategies that I mentioned in the previous slide. And so the first year that we had work plan items focused on climate was FY21. And that fiscal year starts in 2020 and ends in 2021. July is the start of our fiscal year. And that year we had these 5 projects within the work plan. And I'm going to show you the progression of that work plan from that first year when we started working on things explicitly to FY23, which will be starting in July, this coming July 1st. So in FY21, we had 5 projects. That first project, multi-year implementation planning, was sort of what I just described, looking forward 3 to 5 years and trying to understand what are those threads, what are those pathways that CMAP ought to be focusing on as we try to address this climate challenge, and plotting out the different projects or phases of projects that would have to occur between now and 3 to 5 years from now. A few of those more discrete projects, project 2 here, transportation greenhouse gas emissions mitigation strategies. So Martin Menninger has been leading this work, and he'll talk a little bit more about it later in this presentation. But essentially, that project was focused around doing some modeling and examining different strategies that would reduce emissions from the transportation system. And we deliberately chose the transportation system, I think, if it's not already abundantly obvious, because we're a transportation agency and we think that is an area where we can have the most impact for the region. The third project here is climate mitigation and adaptation technical assistance. And this work has been led by Brian Daly. Essentially, we have generated an internal guide for our planning team on how they can incorporate climate data, climate strategies into our local planning projects. Most of those projects are done through our local technical assistance program. And so that guide is intended for our own internal planners to understand how to better integrate climate strategies into those local plans. The fourth project here, climate data inventory and refinement. We wanted to do an assessment of what data CMAP has that relate to climate, either directly or tangentially, that we can provide to the region to support decision making. And how should we do that? Is the data hub the best way to do that, or is maybe there another approach to providing data out to the region? And then finally that year, greenhouse gas reporting and performance monitoring. As most of you I'm sure know, the region is in non-compliance for air quality standards, and CMAP is responsible for tracking our transportation projects and how those either contribute to a reduction in air pollutant emissions or don't. And historically, we have not tracked greenhouse gases separately from air pollution that contribute to air quality, but we are going to start doing that And so this project was focused on how best can we do that? How should we do that? How should we report out on greenhouse gas emissions, et cetera? Next slide, please. And I think I'll mention, just as an aside, I think we're going to hold questions until the end of this longish presentation, and then we'll do all Q&A at the end. So moving on to the next fiscal year, and that's the fiscal year that we are in currently, that is wrapping up at the end of June. Those 5 projects that I described continued this year, and we added 3 new projects. Those are the projects in yellow here. Project 6, Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Strategy. That work is being led by Brian Daly, and he'll present a little bit of the work to you today. But essentially, we think that there may be a role for CMAP to accelerate the equitable deployment of electric vehicle charging infrastructure throughout the region. So we think there's a role to play, but we're not exactly sure what that role is. And so we held an EV forum in late February to try to gather that kind of information and have a discussion about what are the big gaps that need to be filled, and how might CMAP help in that effort. And then finally, Project 7 here, Regional Greenhouse Gas Inventory. So Jared will present some of the results of that. That is a project that we do every 5 years to assess emissions and have a trend on emissions from the different sectors. So you'll hear from Jared a little bit on that in a moment. And then finally, we embarked on a regional transportation vulnerability assessment project, which is a project that, well, we started this before IJA was passed. And then when IJA was passed, we saw that within that bill, there's quite a bit of money for building up resilience. So we want to take advantage of that. And in order to best identify how to most effectively and efficiently invest the federal and state monies that are intended for resilience, we first have to understand, where are we vulnerable? So this project that's being led by Keta Vasic is intended to do just that: assess the transportation system for vulnerability, and then identify the most critical transportation assets that we need to invest in for greater resilience. And then next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, well, I don't see a change. There we go. Okay. All right, so starting July 1, there will be some shifts in the work that we're doing. Some of the work will be ongoing, and some of the work will be new. The first project here, Regional Climate Planning and Coordination, basically it's a project through which we will interact with all of our partners in a more general way. We will look at things like how we're communicating about climate issues. We will look at things like climate equity within this project. There are a number of sub-projects within this that don't exactly warrant their own large projects, but there's a lot of pieces to that. And that's oriented around kind of keeping the discussion going and moving. Project 2, Regional Transportation Mitigation Planning. So as I mentioned, Martin's been leading our modeling work to look at mitigation strategies for the transportation sector. That project is going to move into a planning phase next year. And we hope that that will result in a mitigation plan for the transportation sector at the regional scale that our major partners will participate in developing and then buy into and implement. Project 3, Integrating Resilience into Planning Practices. This is an evolution of that local technical assistance work that I described that Brian was leading. This project is focused on, okay, how are we going to actually do this? How are we going to implement some of our climate strategies through our local planning work? And then beyond that, start implementing that through our local technical assistance program. Project 4, this is a follow-on to the work that Brian led this year. electric vehicle infrastructure planning. So we're identifying the role that CMAP can play in getting a regional and equitable charging network established throughout the region. So this project will move into a planning phase starting on July 1. Project 5, I already described the vulnerability assessment. That will be ongoing next year. Next slide. Project 6 and 7 are new projects that are focused on flooding and resilience to flooding. Project 6 is trying to understand how flood mitigation investment decisions are made by our partners such as MWRD, such as the Lake County SNC, or really any entity that is making investment decisions around flood mitigation. How are those decisions being made, and how could they be made more equitably? This project has not started yet, but it is being funded through a congressional appropriation that we received through the infrastructure bill. So we're sort of waiting to hear when that money is going to start flowing, but we're excited about that work. And then I think many of you are familiar with our flood susceptibility index, which we released a few years ago. We also received some funding through that same appropriation to update that FSI with new data and maybe new methodologies as well. Finally, in FY23, all of our water work is now included under our climate sort of umbrella. So there are a number of things that we do that most of you are familiar with: water supply planning, water quality management planning, and watershed planning. Those last three are focused on water quality, whereas project number 8 is focused on water supply. So that work will be ongoing, and we'll have a new watershed project next year as well. Next. So just shifting gears briefly, because I think it's important to talk a little bit about how we are thinking about our climate work, right, which I just described. New funding that is coming through the infrastructure bill to the region and to the state, and how we intend to kind of connect those things together. So there are new funding programs that are being established. These are just two of those. The Carbon Reduction Program, which is intended to reduce emissions, and the Protect Program, which is intended to increase resilience. There's quite a bit of funding within both of these programs that will flow to the state. We're not entirely sure right now what role CMAP will have in that funding, but we're in conversations with IDOT to try to understand what our role could be and how that funding could be most efficiently and effectively deployed throughout the state and throughout the region. But as you can see, a significant amount of funding will be flowing. And so most of this funding is intended for capital investments that will either reduce emissions or increase resilience. Next slide, please. And so this, I think, is my last slide. And by way of an example, one of the things that we're exploring is how do our existing funding programs work, and how might they be modified, amended to better direct some of this new funding to projects that meet the criteria of the federal government and/or criteria that the state and/or CMAP would establish. Currently, we have a green infrastructure scoring factor as part of our STP shared fund, our Surface Transportation Funding Shared Fund. This was implemented a number of years ago, and it's intended to encourage applicants for transportation funding to incorporate green infrastructure practices into their policies and also into their capital projects, the projects that they are proposing to be funded through CMAP programs. So half of the points that are available for this particular factor are intended to encourage policy adoption. So that is, we would like applicants to adopt policies that support green infrastructure. And we're fairly permissive as it relates to the kinds of things. It could show up in a comprehensive plan. It could show up in a long-term transportation plan, things like that. So half of the points are for policies that are adopted to support green infrastructure, and then half of the points are for practices that are incorporated into the project that's being proposed overall. So this is an element that we are looking at amending in order to incorporate greater sense of resiliency into this particular program. And so we're actively doing that now, kind of unpacking this green infrastructure factor and understanding how can we modify this to encourage greater resilience in projects through that STP shared fund. And we will do that for our other programs as well, whether it's on the mitigation side of things or the resilience side of things. And so this is how we're looking at CMAP's ability to implement some of the climate goals that we have and strategies, and also utilize infrastructure funding to achieve some of those goals. And so I think that's my last slide. And as I mentioned, I think we're going to hold questions till the end, but I will look forward to any discussion and any questions you might have. So thank you very much. And I think maybe Jared is next, is that right?
I believe that's correct. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jared Patton. I'm a senior planner here at CMAP, and I'm going to be giving you a quick overview of the upcoming regional greenhouse gas emissions inventory. This is a really great time to be talking about the project because we've been working on it for about 11 months, which means we are almost finished, but we haven't finalized all of our deliverables. That said, we do have some preliminary results to share, and you're going to be the first group to see them, so that's pretty exciting. If you go to the next slide, I can start with a little bit of background about the project before I get into the results themselves. So this is our third time doing an inventory. The last two were for 2010 and 2015. And both of those inventories looked at emissions from three primary sectors: buildings or stationary energy, that's mostly electricity and natural gas; transportation, and here we're really talking about surface transportation, so roads and railways; and then finally waste and wastewater. Both of those inventories broke the data down at the county level, and we did split out the city of Chicago and suburban Cook counties, two separate entities, but it was primarily a county-based inventory. And then finally, a quick note, the reason why we're doing this work is not just to provide a snapshot of where we are, but also to track our progress towards CMAP's GHG emissions reduction target, which is 80% by 2050. The next slide has a little bit of information about how this inventory is a little bit different. The first big change you'll notice is that we're doing this for 2019 rather than 2020. That is for reasons that are probably a little obvious, but I can go ahead and say 2020 was not a very representative year for our region. So we decided that if we're going to do something that's going to set our policy for the next few years, we wanted to try to ignore some of those pandemic lockdowns, and we'll really pick up some of those post-pandemic trends with our next iteration of this project. Other than that, the headline really is that this inventory is doing everything we've done in the past, plus a few additional things. So first off, we're going to be looking at takeoffs and landings at O'Hare and Midway. So that's a little bit of aviation data. That's not required by the protocol that we use, but it was a hole in our inventory that we thought we could plug. Secondly, we're using a new emissions factor for electricity, and that's really just a fancy way of saying that we're going to better account for the high proportion of nuclear energy that we have in the region compared to other parts of the Midwest. And then finally, and this is the part I'm most excited about, we're going to be providing as much local data as possible, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that means in a moment. If you go to the next slide, we can get to some of the results from the inventory, and I do want to warn there is a slight typo on this slide, which drives me crazy, but it did happen. The banner headline here is that the region generated 113 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent in 2019. I'm sure that doesn't mean a lot to many people on this call. I'm not really sure what a CO2e is myself, but it is a helpful metric to track over time. So that number represents an 8% reduction in overall emissions since 2010. And here's the typo, it's a 3% reduction since 2015. It's really 3.4% reduction. So this is telling us that our emissions are still reducing, but the rate of that reduction is kind of slowing a little bit, which we don't like to see. The chart on the right side here gives a little bit more detailed of a breakdown. We can see that in all three of our inventory years, stationary energy, again, electricity and natural gas, represents about 2/3 of our region's emissions, with transportation making up most of that remaining third. In all of these years, both stationary energy and waste saw pretty good reductions, but transportation is seeing a different trend. It's a little bit stickier. We saw the emissions from transportation actually increase in the last inventory. That resulted in a 2% increase in transportation emissions between 2010 and 2019. And without getting into too much detail, that trend was mostly driven by an increase in VMT and also a shift away from passenger cars towards passenger trucks and SUVs. The next slide has some detail geographically. So this is broken down at the county level. Again, City of Chicago and suburban Cook County separated into two different entities. And here we can see that suburban Cook County is actually the largest producer of emissions in absolute terms, with Kendall County generating the fewest. The dots on this chart represent per capita emissions rates, and here we see the City of Chicago is the most efficient, while Will County generates the most on a per capita level by a pretty wide margin. Next slide. This is the last point that I'll make about the results, and here the actual details. I know you can't read it. Really what I want to share is not the information itself, but the format. This is more or less what our local summaries are going to look like. So I mentioned we're going to be providing a lot of local data. This is how we hope to do it. We're going to be producing these emission summaries for all 284 municipalities and all 77 Chicago community areas. And the goal here is not to produce a full greenhouse gas emissions inventory. There are some important data sets that are missing, things like off-road energy, or off-road emissions rather. Some things are proxied, but for most of our communities, probably 90% of the communities in the area, this document is going to be good enough to get started. So if you're trying to report your emissions through something like GCOM, you might need to take this a little bit further, but if you're just trying to get started, this is a great place to begin. And it has emissions from most major sources, so electricity and transportation, as well as some related indicators like EV registrations, commute mode share, tree canopy coverage. There's some really interesting stuff in here. So I'm really excited to share this with you. If you go to the next slide, this is the final thing that I'm going to talk about, next steps. The very first thing we're going to be doing is trying to share the inventory and the local summaries. And that's a place where we could really use your help, because I think both the regional inventory and local emission summaries have the potential to be incredibly useful, but only if people know they exist. If they just live on CMAP's website and people don't see them, then we won't get much for all this work, but there is a lot of potential if people are familiar with the data. Following that, we're going to do some additional analysis. We're going to look at new ways to split the data up, see if there are trends that we're missing. And this is something that we can do internally and externally. As Jason mentioned, we're planning to share all of this data in its raw form. So we'd invite everyone to take a look at that. Research institutions, academic institutions, if people want to play around with it, I think that's a win for the region. And then finally, and this is the other place where we could really use your help and your creative thinking, is to find ways to integrate this into CMAP's work. We are a transportation agency. Transportation emissions are still going up. I think there's a lot of room for us to improve in this area. And over the next months and years, I'm excited to see how you can all contribute to that conversation. That's everything that I have now. So I'm going to stop talking and hand it off to whoever's next. Thank you.
All right, I think that's me. Yes. Next slide. All right, this is Martin Menninger. I want to quickly orient you to the transportation mitigation project I've been leading. Sort of building off of Jared's work, we were really focused in a little bit on-road transportation, where CMAP plays a big role. On this slide, you can see sort of our emissions projections by vehicle type at the top. If you quickly jump down to the bottom of this slide, you see the blue and red bars. Those represent passenger vehicles. They are about 90% of travel, or vehicle miles traveled in the region. But if you jump back up to the top, they're only 60 to 70% of emissions. Obviously, that's trucks are bigger. We're a major freight hub for the country. But just some context to keep in mind as we go through some of these other slides. If you want to jump to the next one. What we did for this project is look at a variety of scenarios, interventions, policies that could be implemented to reduce emissions. On the left side, you'll see some of the things that we can really put in our traditional travel demand model. These are things like improving the efficiency of the roadway system through technologies or building projects, reducing demand on the system from work from home, which is a big one we've seen, or making driving more expensive. And then our last sort of thing that it goes into our traditional travel model is mode shift. So getting more people on transit through transit investments or active modes of travel. Once we had sort of modeled all of these things in our traditional model, we got to a list of strategies that didn't fit in that model. And so we take those things like vehicle fuel and technology aren't inputs or outputs of our traditional travel model. We have a tool called Moves that we feed our travel model results into, and that has fleet characteristics, engine characteristics, fuel type, and things like that. So we can look at other strategies that impact those kinds of things, different improved vehicle efficiency, electrification, or other alternative fuels are strategies we can look at there. Things we haven't quite gotten to, but know are important, are things like land use, can have a big impact on mode share and how people travel, other forms of transportation. As we talk about electricity, we're understanding more and more, just switching to electricity isn't zero emissions. We have to think about the source of that electricity. Jared touched on that a little bit. And then vehicles are not the only source of emissions in the roadway system. The steel, the asphalt, the construction equipment are all have emissions associated with them. And so those are things we need to be thinking about too, as a transportation focused agency. Next slide. So one thing to keep in mind, we modeled a lot of strategies that impact the transportation system, and we are specifically looking at greenhouse gases for this project. But many of those strategies have benefits beyond emissions, whether it's improving transit ridership or equity. This slide is looking at particulate matter versus greenhouse gases. And in general, there's a correlation between those, but we saw some strategies that dramatically reduce travel and dramatically reduce transit ridership. So we have to sort of keep things like that in mind. If you look at the bottom axis and these strategies, most of the strategies we modeled were somewhere between 1 and 4% reduction in emissions. I personally was hoping for a little bit more, but that's where we landed with most of the strategies we modeled. A few increased emissions. There's one outlier on this slide. Our forcing 50% of people to work from home got us a 10% reduction in emissions. It's a little bit of an extreme scenario that we did early in the pandemic, but in general, the travel demand in the region is relatively inflexible to most of the strategies we modeled, and therefore the change in emissions was relatively small for each individual strategy for the region as a whole. The last thing I'll say about that is, dramatically increasing transit ridership might have a big impact on one community and smaller on another. So we need to sort of think about these strategies where they make sense, where they're most efficient. One strategy might work in one place and another in another, and so we can add them together and have sort of a bigger impact. Next slide. This slide shows it with the red line our most recent emissions projections from our conformity run. We're getting ready to update this, but this is still the best one out there. And as you see, emissions go down a little bit, but they don't really go down. At the end, they start to go back up. And so part of this project is thinking about where do we need to get to and how can we get there? We think that needs to be a regional conversation, but we're thinking about, you know, what are the actual steps? What are the things that are actually going to move the needle and get us to one of these blue lines as we build consensus as a region to try to reduce emissions. Next slide. Some takeaways from this project. This isn't a comprehensive list of everything that we can do to reduce emissions. We're sort of looking at different categories and types of things that we can do, but there's many different strategies that can be implemented. Even though each strategy had a relatively small impact, we think that applying them to the right area and the right situation, we can sort of complement each other and build up to a bigger impact. One thing we discovered going through this is our modeling tools are slow. Some of the parameters we're using need to be updated. We're updating our moves model right now, but we still have a little bit of work to do to be able to churn out results quickly and up to date as we would like to. And then finally, as I mentioned on the last slide, we're working towards a regional target and consensus around some of these strategies, and you'll hear more about that work in the year or years to come. And with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Brian.
All right, thanks, Martin. So hopefully this set of presentations gives you all an idea of how we approach mitigation programmatically. The GHG inventory shows us where emissions stand across sectors. The Transportation Mitigation Project looks at the impact of potential policies to reduce emissions. And this project, the EV charging infrastructure strategy, explores how CMAP can influence implementation in one promising policy area. So next slide, please. With the continued growth of EVs and the readily apparent concerns about equity and other policy needs, CMAP wanted to go deeper on this topic and determine what our role could be. We were also mindful of growing state and federal legislative attention to EVs, which made it even more urgent that we understand the topic as investment by many of our partners accelerates. So we wanted to take this year to kind of assess gaps and priorities for a regional network of publicly accessible charging infrastructure. About 80% of EV charging happens at home, but our project focused on publicly accessible infrastructure. In particular, we wanted to use our implementation levers to overcome gaps that the private market and other public programs are unlikely to address. So when we talked about publicly accessible charging infrastructure, we were looking at a few different use cases, including residential charging for EV users who rely on on-street parking or live in multi-unit dwellings, as well as corridor charging along the expressway system to facilitate long-distance travel, and destination and community charging, including in downtown districts and retail corridors, as well as fleet charging that could help facilitate shifts to medium and heavy-duty electric vehicles. Next slide, please. So this slide shows a map of level 2 and level 3 chargers throughout the region. And just real quickly, without getting too deep into the weeds, level 2, there are 3 levels of EV charging infrastructure. Level 2 basically charges a passenger vehicle overnight fully, and level 3, or a fast charger, can fully charge a battery in 20 to 30 minutes. So these are the types of chargers that could be useful for a lot of the use cases we were looking at. And you can see from the map, every dot represents a location with EV charging. They're concentrated in Chicago, and become sparser the farther you go from downtown. Additionally, the map shows the economically disconnected areas data set that CMAP uses when it's thinking about equity. And only 10 to 15% of the region's charging infrastructure is located within EVAs. So that's part of the equity concern. There are also other factors that complicate equity in EV charging. Some of these publicly accessible locations are actually within parking garages where you have to pay by the hour to park, and other places like that where there are kind of restrictions that would keep someone from using it as maybe their main charger. So I won't get too deep into the map or the data, but happy to take questions on that now or at another time later in the meeting. So we, through our research, based on interviews and research we were doing, we kind of identified 5 main categories of barrier to establishing a network of EV infrastructure throughout the region. And these are kind of the broad categories. Financial barriers, which would include identifying funding sources for public investment, the high cost of DC fast chargers, and the need to plan for long-term operations and maintenance needs. There are market barriers. By this, we mostly mean the lack of current private investment in communities of color, lower income communities, rural communities, and other areas where EV ownership is currently low. Regulatory barriers, which could include outdating zoning and building codes, lengthy permitting processes, and restrictions on the use of the right-of-way and other public areas for charging infrastructure. Planning and information barriers, which includes the need for standards for signage and wayfinding, the lack of information on optimal density and location of charging stations, site selection criteria, and things like that. And then technological barriers, which includes the need for standards for charger types and payment systems, potential strain on the electrical grid, and the difficulty of electrifying heavy-duty vehicles. So on the next slide, Jason mentioned that we held a forum in February. We had this at the end of February. More than 30 individuals participated. Some of them are part of this committee. It included members of state and local governments, community organizations, the private sector, and academia, including organizations that work with communities with low access to charging. At the meeting, we presented these barriers from the previous slide and the set of implementation levers that CMAP thinks about, things like convening partners, providing data, providing technical assistance, providing funding. And we got feedback from the attendees on a few key topics: how to define equity in EV charging, verifying that these categories of barriers captured what they were seeing in their work, and then identifying priorities for CMAP's work to address those barriers. Next slide, please. So some of the things that we heard at the forum, one of the big ones was that freight and medium and heavy duty vehicles were underrepresented in the conversation. The many studies and funding programs that are active now are pretty heavily focused on passenger vehicles and other light duty vehicles. Obviously, as a freight hub, Chicago has a lot of medium and heavy duty vehicles moving through it. And that's also a big component of the equity and environmental justice angle. With so many freight and intermodal facilities, communities near them bear the brunt of tailpipe emissions. And a focus on charging infrastructure in those communities could both mitigate emissions and provide a benefit to drivers in those communities. Financial barriers were ranked as the most significant category by many of the attendees. And that includes costs outside of charging, like the price of vehicles. So that's a little bit outside the scope of our work, but it is a big concern. And then the other thing I wanted to highlight here is the importance of focusing on overall mobility needs rather than just on installing more EV charging. Some of the communities where it would be hardest to install charging, like dense urban communities with lots of multi-unit dwellings and limited parking, residents of those areas may actually want other solutions. It may not be about charging infrastructure for personal vehicles. So using engagement to meet with those communities to make sure that needs are being met, which could include car sharing, investment in transit, biking, and walking, but looking beyond just putting in more chargers. Lastly, the need for capacity building is important. This is a new policy area. It's a new technology, new funding programs. So there's a lot of local partners who are interested in this, who are looking for guidance and assistance in accessing some of the funding and knowledge that's out there. So on the last slide, we talk a little bit about some of the directions for future work. Just at a really high level here, there is a possibility of funding and programming. There is new funding coming online from the federal government soon. The funding and programming angle might be, for CMAP's perspective, might be a small set of specific cases. We want to be deliberate about leveraging public funds into those places where the private market isn't serving community needs. So establishing equity criteria for programming could be helpful, not just for CMAP's purposes, but for other partners as well. Supporting partner implementation, which could be through technical assistance, data provision, matchmaking for funding opportunities, and sharing successful models. We definitely want to explore a role for CMAP in exploring the freight, fleet, and medium and heavy duty vehicles, working with our partners in the freight space to try to figure out the best role for us going forward, and convening in coordination, and not just our own processes, but participating in the ongoing work that the Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus, IDOT, and others are pursuing. So we are participating in those processes. And lastly, we'll continue doing research on policy and regulatory needs at various scales of government to try to help fill that gap for our partners. So that's an overview of the EV project. Hopefully this gives you a good sampling of the work that we're doing on transportation mitigation. If you advance to the next slide, we have some discussion questions. But before we get into those discussion questions specifically, we did want to recognize some of the questions that have come in to the chat from members over the course of the discussion. So I think the first comment that came in was from Naomi Davis. Naomi, you had a book recommendation and an event coming up. Did you want to speak to those?
Yes, I would, because Dr. Shalonda Baker, for those who may not be familiar with her, is not only an attorney who has a deep seasoning in industry transactional work at the industry and commercial levels, but a lot, just decades of policy work. And Revolutionary Power gives us a step-by-step look at how equity can and must be implemented, and how the traditional approaches which we tend to take when we look at climate mitigation, for example, simply are absolutely bound to perpetuate the inequities and open up the disparities. And so that this idea that equity is an add-on, is an afterthought, and I know many of us have heard this many, many times now at this point in the evolution of American thought, but we absolutely must understand that without centering and prioritizing equity structurally in the ways that are talked about in that book, you can get it on Audible or whatever and just listen to it. It's a very, very easy read. It's very personal. It's very tactical. And I think everyone who's committed to equity in this work owes themselves the joy of getting that kind of clarity and that kind of compelling rationale. So I would say that. And then I'll say our Black Energy Justice retreat coming up the end of July is also a place you'll get a formal invitation, all of you will, for masterminding at the table. We at Blacks in Green are working specifically to implement a clean, flexible, affordable energy microgrid in West Woodlawn, and really want and are strongly requesting your participation at the table, where this actual community-owned and managed grid can and will emerge. So we're looking for those federal dollars. I'll be very mercenary in saying that. We are building an energy department, and these issues that we're surfacing here are fundamental at our sustainable square mile level, but also with the idea of scaling up regionally, especially where Black and Brown folks live. So that's our story, our heartfelt desire, and our personal invitation.
Thanks,
Hello?
Naomi. Thanks. Brian, did you want to keep going through the questions in the chat, or did you want to open it up for discussion to your questions on the slide?
Sure. I'll highlight a couple of questions from members in the chat. I know some of them may have been answered by staff in the chat already. Marcella, you had a question about traffic safety projects and scoring. I don't know if you wanted to follow up on that.
I think Kate and Jason both kind of addressed it in chat, so that's fine.
Okay, great. And then Red, you mentioned that the EPA is proposing tightening some of the emissions targets for trucks and buses. I'm not sure if there was a question there or if you wanted to pursue that further.
No, it was just there were I think there was a slide that was showing goals of emissions, and I just wanted to highlight that those will likely be changing if EPA is successful on those proposals.
Great, that's an important point to raise. Thanks for that. And then Stacy, you had a few questions about the greenhouse gas inventory. You had a few of those, so maybe I'll turn that over to you to ask that question.
Sure. Thank you for the presentation. That was insightful. In looking at, and some of this might be tied up in the land use portion that's in the future, but I'm curious as to how TDL is going to be integrated into the picture, because certainly freight, warehousing, and intermodal activities have an effect on emissions, both as a cause and effect, right? Are those being accounted for anywhere, or is it just the trucks moving in and out and the commuters moving in and out?
Yeah, so it really is mostly calculated through the transportation models. So moves on road and off road is how we're getting most of those emissions. And then anything that's happening on site would be in the, for the things like electricity or natural gas consumption would show up in the utility data. So we don't have it specifically called out, but most or all of those emissions should be getting captured.
Okay, thank you. And then the other is, I see that land use is going to be studied in the future. Do you know exactly what that's going to entail?
Yeah, I personally do not. The protocol that we use for this inventory is the GPC basic protocol, which doesn't include land use considerations. So things like sinks and sources. Obviously, that's a big hole, and it's something that we're going to be exploring how we can include in the future, because it does have a huge impact. But at this time, it's not included.
Okay, I was just confused because it said future land use, and certainly how these things complement has a significant impact on the surrounding environment and communities, both in the area as well as in the region, as far as citing. If Ileana is a teacher. I'm wondering also about equity. How is that going to be integrated into the analysis?
Yeah, so equity is definitely something that we're going to be looking at. The inventory itself is kind of a snapshot in time report. So right now our focus is on just figuring out where we are. And then we've structured the project in a way that we're going to have more raw data than we have before, so that we can do some of those follow-up analysis and hopefully work with some external partners to do some of that as well. I will say the local emission summaries are intended to make this kind of work accessible to a broader range of communities than have ever been able to do it before. And that's because it costs a lot of money to do an inventory and to gather some of this information. So the hope is that just by providing that information, we can move that needle a little bit, but it is something that will hopefully happen more in the coming years.
Last one, please. How I know that you guys are updating your data, which is excellent. I'm following the IPCC and UN reports regarding the numbers, and I'm sure you saw, unfortunately, the report that came out a little over 2 weeks ago now, which basically revised the projections to 3.2 degrees Celsius, as well as the need to cap not by 2030 but 2025 in order to reach our targets. How is that going to be accounted for or adjusted in our approach in order to meet that 3-year deadline for our initial milestone?
That's a great question. I think that I might punt that to someone else.
It is a great question. I don't think we have a solid answer for you, Stacy. I mean, it's very challenging as a long-term planning, regional scale entity to continue to set targets when the targets keep changing, like the goal, the goal line and whatnot. So, we're aware of the changes that are afoot, and we're trying to figure out how to move more quickly and nimbly, but it is challenging. So it's a group effort. So your thoughts on how we do that are certainly appreciated.
The only comment that I would make in that I appreciate that we've got this moving goal line, right? And moving milestones with the moving goal line, many moving parts. I will reiterate, and I understand and respect your focus, but in looking at future land use studies, the one that you did in Moving Will County has a lot of power to it. In understanding that nature is over 30% of our solution as a carbon sink. And if you look at reductions to Midewin's global habitat for grassland birds and the viability of grasslands there, the reductions in habitat are from 20,000 to 5,000 with Piatone, Ileana, and North Point in play. So land use and our transportation vectors, as well as the industries that depend upon where our roads are sited, have, as you very well know, a significant effect on a third of the solution for carbon. And so I think in looking at siting transportation and land use, which is the birth of CMAP, right, is the amalgam of the two, that future analysis is really essential sooner rather than later to ensure that we're not sacrificing Peter to pay Paul.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Stacy. Thank you for the constant reminder.
Right. And in the interest of getting to a little bit more of the sort of overarching discussion, I think we might move towards some of those discussion questions, but I did want to just cover a couple of things from the chat. One is, I know that we've gotten a few comments in from members of the public who are not members of the committee, and I just want to recognize that we've received those and we will read those into the record in the public comment portion of the meeting coming up. And I know we got a few specific questions about sort of Tesla chargers and the percentage of the region that's covered by EDAs. We did look at all that in the study. I think if we have specific questions about that, I'd be happy to correspond directly with the people who had questions on those. But I think we might want to move towards some of the overarching questions about what we might be missing in our mitigation program, which I think some of you are getting to with your questions already. So Aaron, if you wanted to kind of draw out some of those questions.
Thanks so much, Brian. So we've kind of gone through the first bullet on this slide here about some of those specific answers. Hopefully, if they haven't been addressed in the chat, you can follow up with the appropriate staff at CMAP to make those clarifications. I guess just before that happens, Brian, could you do just a quick, or Jason, a quick run through of each of the items when those will be shared and presented in public? I think that would help with some of the clarification when this material would be made available sort of outside of a committee presentation.
So when you say which of the items?
So like the EV analysis, or I know you said this is the first, Jared said this is the first time that the GHG inventory, the 2019 one, has been presented, but maybe a rough timeline of when that might be available.
Sure. So the inventory, Jared, please correct me if I'm wrong. It is in wrapping up stages. So we will be releasing it, announcing it in, I don't think it'll be July, but it'll be probably August, September, when all that information gets released. The other projects we have going are sort of in process. And so there aren't deliverables per se, but we do provide updates through our weekly, what is going to be now bi-weekly, in other words, every 2 weeks, on a Thursday, our newsletters go out where we provide some project updates. So that's another vehicle we have to do more public-facing releases. Team, are there other things that we're planning to release in the nearer term that I'm not remembering?
I can't think of any specific releases that are coming up. I mean, some of these kind of come out in little spurts of committee activity, and now that our committees are more active again, I think there'll be a lot of presentations there. And I'd encourage people to take a look at some of the all our meetings are recorded and posted on YouTube and our website now. So if you're interested in more discussion of some of the Onto 2050 updates and scoring for the regionally significant projects and things like that, some of those presentations are there, and we can share links to those as well.
Thanks. One other specific one, the modeling effort, the transportation emissions modeling, and what were the strategies represented by those dots on the chart? Is there information on the modeling program available somewhere? I know some of that's work in progress for sure, but
not currently, no. There's nothing publicly available yet.
Okay, thank you. I would welcome folks to address the second bullet there, the regional work that your organizations are doing that aligns in the chat. I think there's been some great examples of that already put into the chat. Thank you very much. Edith, you've had your hand up for a second. Would you like to jump in?
Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Sure can.
Great. Okay, I apologize. I'm at a conference. I wanted to go back to bullet 1, and I have 1 kudos and then 2 significant questions on the work plan. So first, I'm really excited with the regional snapshots on the greenhouse gas inventory. So we couldn't be more excited about that. And thank you for that accommodation, and also for adding air travel. That's really important for data. So good work there. Very significant question related to adaptation and transportation. So let me just get out the one on adaptation. So why is there nothing on heat vulnerability? I see that there's a new work being proposed, or additional work on updating the flood vulnerability index, but the regional climate risk and vulnerability assessment identified extreme heat, and I didn't see any actions related to that. So first, an answer or response on that, and then I'll get into the transportation question.
Sure, Edith, thank you. So we are in the process of figuring out how we're going to do a heat susceptibility index, sort of a parallel product to the FSI. So that is in discussion, but in fact, I was on a call with some academic and Argonne partners last week who said that they also were working on a heat susceptibility index, I think for the city or maybe Cook County. And then I think there's one other one happening. So I think there are multiple heat susceptibility analyses going on, but that is on our agenda, and the degree to which we address that within our project, our regional transportation vulnerability assessment project, it is one of the hazards that we will be looking at. However, it doesn't have the same let's say spatial specificity that like urban flooding does. So certainly flooding is a more directly measurable, like what's the impact in this particular place or this particular asset. Heat is less easy to do that for. So the way that we do that within our TVA project is we're still figuring that out. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, so if there's others being done in the region, that's something that you would address in the regional coordination work that you suggested. Is that correct?
Yes, yes.
Okay, I think just in the work plan, it might be great to see that, recognizing that it is a priority, because it seemed like the list of work projects was amply detailed in terms of priorities, that could be just acknowledged. It is a significant threat.
Okay. I would also just say, Edith, that we'll be talking more at the September meeting about some of the resilience and vulnerability aspects of our climate work plan. So hopefully we'll be able to talk about heat a little bit more in that context in September.
Okay, thank you. And then my second question related to the work plan on the transportation, on the mitigation strategies. So I'm glad with the work that's been done on the EV forum, and I apologize that I was not able to attend that. But it seems as if CMAP is still looking for its place in that universe. And I'm at an EV charging infrastructure conference currently, and there's a lot of work going on very rapidly. So to the extent that CMAP can find its place in that universe, it would be a welcome thing. But more than that, I'm struck by the disconnect between the greenhouse gas emissions reporting, particularly the work that Martin did, and the focus on a yet undefined role in EV charging and nothing on reducing vehicle miles traveled as a focus area for mitigation, and looking particularly at the use of freight and single occupancy vehicles, noting in the chat as well that CMAP sits on a lot of transportation funding and is making decisions currently to expand road miles and continuing to invest in infrastructure that supports single occupancy vehicle, but not seeing a strategy specifically called out in the work plan that would reduce vehicle miles traveled. So I'm wondering if you wanted to just respond to that concern. And that's for Jason or Brian, whoever wants to tackle that, or Martin.
Well, I might ask Martin to respond to maybe just address, how we look at reducing VMT and the effectiveness of some of the strategies we've looked at, maybe as part of the mitigation work that he did, or maybe just separately as an agency, when we look at those strategies, what some of the outputs are. But Edith, that is not, we're not ignoring that. We're not ignoring the potential to reduce VMT. We're not ignoring the land use implications for climate and all of the things. What we are trying to do is to model individual strategies to try to understand which are the most effective. So for example, Martin modeled, if we were to implement all of the transit regionally significant projects, what would the impact be on emissions, vis-a-vis reduction in VMT? If we increased ridership by X, how would that affect climate? So Martin, are you on and in a place where you can respond to that?
Sure, yeah. So reducing VMT is definitely part of the solution. What we've sort of seen and what others have said as well is we need an all of the above approach. Reducing VMT is part of the answer. One issue is we don't see that as going to get us all the way. There are parts of the region where transit just we're not going to make it practical. We can't build the red line within 2 blocks of every house in the region. And so we're going to have other strategies too. And so just, it's about finding the right strategies for the right communities and things like that. Yeah, so I think reducing VMT definitely makes sense as part of an overall framework for how we get to where we need to be.
I'll just pipe in and share that some of the transportation related strategies really are in the transportation focused area. And so again, with the number of projects that we have going on across the agency, it's difficult to list every single thing that we're working on when we're trying to provide and get input and feedback on some of these things. So we do have a project underway right now that's looking at mobility and the changes in mobility across our region. I'll just share that unfortunately, even when the stay-at-home orders were in effect, our air quality did not improve by as much as we saw in other places, coastal places that had big ports. Partially because goods movement and freight and logistics continues to be a strong part of our economy. And so we do need to balance sort of our movements and our environmental resilience initiatives at the same time. One of the other things that we're highly concerned about is almost every hour of the day, traffic has increased and is above year over year prior to 10 to 15% above where we were in 2019 before the pandemic. And so people are moving around, and they're also moving around more hours of the day than they were previously. Almost every day is high, every hour of the day is higher than it was in 2019, except for those morning peak hours, which leads me to believe that people like to sleep in. So those are some of the things that we're looking at actively and trying to assess, like with remote work, are people taking more trips to the grocery store or more trips to get things during the middle of the day as opposed to the beginning of the ends of the day? And how can we help support communities do things like operationalize complete streets? There's a lot of new funding for complete streets and healthy streets in the infrastructure bill. Can we help them sort of think about what that future of transportation might look like in a downtown suburban community that's not just the city of Chicago? So a lot of that work is ongoing, and it's happening in sort of other forums that we have. But if that is an interest of this committee, we can certainly bring those projects and project managers here to discuss.
Just one follow-on comment to Aaron's, and that, you know, we also have a major project going on to figure out how do we save the transit system, right? I mean, that's a big challenge right now too. So, you know, if we aren't successful in figuring out how to save these systems, reducing VMT is going to become an even greater challenge. So there's a lot of things happening now that we're trying to develop solutions for.
Thanks, Jason. I think, unfortunately, given the time, I'm going to have to wrap things up from this discussion. Edith, could I ask you to go on mute? Thank you. Sorry, Cynthia, I don't think I can get to your question, just given that we only have a few minutes left, and I know there's a lot of public comment still in the chat that we want to address. So apologies there. If you do have last comments, feel free to put them in the chat so that we can make sure to record them for the meeting minutes. So sorry about that, to be the heavy-handed chair, but I'm going to move us into the other business. And is there any other business, Brian, that needs to be shared? Yeah,
I think there was just one thing. I know Red Mansour wanted to share an update on the City of Chicago's climate action plan.
Yeah, I don't have a lot of time, but yeah, it was released in May. So I don't know if it's appropriate to put the link in the chat, but within that, we also launched the city's Our Roots Chicago initiative to equitably plant trees in priority communities. That's also within the climate action plan. And I just mentioned in the chat that we did win a grant. Jason mentioned the city. It was us with CDPH and Northwestern to build a heat vulnerability index. We're just completing work with NASA Goddard to do a nice 1980 to present time heat map. And once that's complete, we shift into the HVI. So Edith, if you're interested, please contact me. I think you already have my email. And then we also released the Microsoft Research Project Eclipse that many people are already familiar with, a community-based air quality sensing network. And I could also put that in the link. It's something that we're looking to expand on or complement, but it is also included in the climate action plan. Thanks for that time. Appreciate it, Brian.
Thank you. And for those of you who aren't looking at the chat, I would really encourage you to look at the chat because there's a ton of great stuff in there. I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to read all of it, but please do take a look.
Yes, thanks, Brian. And just for everyone, everything in the chat will be recorded into the meeting minutes. For those comments that came not from members of the committee, we'll add those into this next section, the public comment section, to make sure those are recorded and reflected and shared with everyone on the committee, and also those that couldn't be here today. Is there anything else we need to do in the public comment section or other section, Brian?
I'll just mention, because I know he also said in the chat that he was leaving early. We had a public comment from Bob Israel, trustee for the Village of Northbrook. He included a link to a plan he co-authored, the Illinois Livable and Sustainable Transportation Manual, and that they recently gained approval of a climate action plan for the Village of Northbrook. He said it would be a good idea to use some grant funding through county, CMAP, or the state to assist local municipalities to go through the process of developing localized climate action plans, which will address the overarching goals of the regional climate action plan. And he shared his contact information. And then I think Colin Pearsall is a member of the public who submitted a comment in the chat. Mr. Pearsall, I don't know if you wanted to read that or if you wanted us to.
Sure, I can give it a shot. Let me scroll up there. Okay. Hi, I wanted to comment on the regionally significant projects aspect of CMAP's plans. I and other advocates for active transportation are frustrated that the addition of more lane miles of arterials and highways is being considered in the RSP list. We need fewer lane miles, not more, should say more. The assertion that reducing congestion reduces emissions is nonsense. Adding road capacity increases vehicle throughput and speed, which has many negative impacts that more than offset the increases in vehicle efficiency gained by reducing congestion. More lane miles, higher vehicle volumes, and higher speeds add to stormwater runoff, particulate and greenhouse gas emissions, noise, safety, you name it. News just broke that road fatalities in the US went up 18% from 2019 to 2021, the largest 2-year increase in 75 years. We must move to reduce the vehicle throughput and household VMT in light of this. Not only that, but how can we afford to maintain new road lane miles, especially when they're being driven on at higher speeds due to temporarily reduced congestion? We can barely maintain the roads we already have. We will have a better road system if we focus on slimming down the roads with road diets and getting people out of cars and off the road, not putting more vehicles onto it to fill the additional lanes, as always happens.
All right, thank you for sharing the comment. And then David Poe, if you're still on, if you wanted to submit your comment as well.
I'm still on, but I do need to run. I did want to thank CMAP and this committee for all of your work that you're doing to reduce emissions across our region and improve mobility. I've got to run, but thank you so much for the opportunity to speak to you and participate in this forum.
All right, thank you, David. And for those of you who are interested, David's comment is in the chat as well. And it also addresses encouraging biking and walking and slowing down vehicles traveling through our communities. And those were the only public commenters who reached out to us ahead of time, and I believe that covers all of them. I don't know if there is anyone else who wanted to request a verbal comment. I think that's everyone.
Okay, thank you very much. We're just running 1 minute over, but I wanted to just remind everyone that our next meeting is September 27th. So we have a little bit of a break over the summer. I'll see the committee back at 9 a.m. on September 27th. And if there's no other business, this committee is adjourned. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Aaron.
Thanks to CMAP staff for all the great presentations.